Hi, everyone. Welcome to this session, this workshop entitled Environmental Justice and Environmental Racism. I am Karen Bigelow, co-executive director of Creation Justice Ministries, where our mission is to protect, restore, and rightfully share God's creation. This year, we are celebrating 40 years of ministry with our roots, starting in the National Council of Churches. And part of our roots is working on issues related to environmental justice and environmental racism. And so I am very excited to be able to talk about this topic, to be able to look at the history of environmental justice while also looking at where is it currently happening, what is currently happening, and how can our churches be in solidarity and in fellowship and leadership around these issues. Um, I would love to see just in the chat who's in the room. If you can, please share your name and location. And if you know as well, if you can share with us from whose land do you come from? Who are the indigenous people who are stewards and continue to be stewards of the land for which we occupy? I'm from DC, and so for my area, it is belongs to the Piscataway and Nanatucket people. And so we're gonna just to give a bit of an introduction to the topic, environmental justice and environmental racism have long been issues in this country. This is something that has happened for many generations before it frankly even had a term about what was happening. Environmental justice has been an issue for such a long time in this country, and also around the world, but in this country. And as we look at these things, environmental justice is not just about what's happening in the environment, it's also about what are the laws and regulations that are happening that are causing issues to happen, that make it so that people, especially BIPOC communities, are facing these issues at dire constraints. People who are low income are facing these issues at higher constraints. And so environmental justice is not just about what's happening in the environment, but also how are laws and regulations supporting, if not even creating, these issues that we see happening in so many communities? And so, again, this is something that's been happening for a long time. And I want to also point out, despite the narrative that sometimes happens, faith communities have long been a part of this movement. As people who are called to care for creation and to seek justice, we have been doing this work for such a long time. As I said, Creation Justice Ministries, we've been in partnership with this work for 40 years this year. And we also see that part of the environmental justice movement has roots within the faith community. And that includes seeing the environmental justice efforts and protests and demonstrations that happened in Warren County, North Carolina, especially with that having its roots with the UCC denomination. And so we've seen so many examples, and we've seen so much of how this movement has been closely tied and had witness from those in our faith. And so, for that reason, I just wanted to highlight that to say that this is an issue that not only do we belong in, we've been in, and we're called to continue doing this work. It is so great to see you all from different areas, people who are from Piscataway land, from the DC Silver Spring area, my area, people from Baytown, Michigan. I see others in Delaware, in New Jersey. It is so great to see you all and to be able to have this conversation today. I'm going to introduce our panelists. I'm going to say, unfortunately, Richard Moore, who is unfortunately not feeling well, and so he will not be able to join us. But really looking forward to hearing about the work that he does in Albuquerque, New Mexico in particular, especially with him having roots as being one of the first co-chairs of the National Council of Churches Eco Working Group. And so we are sad to say that he cannot join us, but we are so excited to be able to introduce Michelle Roberts, the National Coordinator for the Environmental Justice Health Alliance for Chemical Policy Reform, EJHA, a national network on fence line grassroots and advocacy environmental justice organizations. She is the member of the governing board of the Episcopal Church and author of the recent World Council of Churches Lenten study on water. And so we are so excited to be able to hear from Michelle today. And please, as you continue to have this conversation, let us know if there's any questions that you have. Please put them in the chat. There's also a Q&A function that should be on the right-hand side, I believe, of your screen, where you can share any questions that you have. And then also let us know, what is your church doing? As you see these questions come up, as we ask the questions over the next 20 minutes, please let us know, how exactly is it that your community is experiencing these things? What is your community doing to give witness, to call members of Congress, to speak truth to power when it comes to this work? And so, Michelle, thank you for being here with us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And it's a pleasure and a joy to be here. And again, Richard Moore asked that I extend his sincerest apologies for not being able to join. And I ask that you all keep him in your prayers, as our brother is not feeling well today. He is the National Co-Coordinator for the Environmental Justice Health Alliance for Chemical Policy Reform, along with me. We have a very long name, and we'll shorten it to an acronym of EJHA. But our name is significant because it was given by and intentionally by our grassroots communities.
Thank you. So before we get started in the conversations that I drafted, I would just love to know, you said that the name for your organization came from those who were in the community. Can you tell us why that name? What does it mean to do chemical policy reform?
Well, many of our communities in the EJHA are what we call fence line communities, where they live right next to the fence of some of our nation's most egregious industrial operations. Many of those operations are chemically based, right, and or have a tie into that of the extractive economy, such as the oil and gas. But the bulk of the communities that we serve in EJHA actually are impacted by the chemical manufacturing facilities and have a long stretch over time into actually providing harm in their communities. Um, the reason that they wanted to make sure that it was the Health and Environmental Justice Health Alliance for Chemical Policy Reform, because their health is impacted daily, the health of their bodies, the health of the land, right? The health of their economy and their children. And so they wanted to make sure that the statement was in as to what the impact was on them. But the good news is that they have solutions for the impacts of that they're receiving daily.
And can you talk about what are some of the health impacts that people are experiencing, and not just people, but also the land as well?
Hmm. We think about the fact that, first of all, many of our communities have been, the land has been cleared in order for them in whatever way, right? We have some people who live like in the area of the Gulf Coast, Mossville, Louisiana, for example, where it was the most richest in biodiversity of all of Louisiana. But then came the oil and gas industry. And this community of Mossville now is surrounded by over 16 facilities that include oil and gas, chemical, extractive, you name it. And the health impacts on this community range everywhere from some of the most egregious cancers to heart disease to learning impacts, all of these different things. The unfortunate part about all of this is that in our regulatory system, in our government, we permit this to happen. And what do I mean by this? These corporations intentionally go to the government structures, right? Apply for permits to be able to do what they do. We literally have policies in place that are called risk assessments, where we actually, but the risk assessment, unfortunately, is based on a healthy white man. It does not take into account a child. It does not take into account a pregnant woman. It does not take into account people who are already sick. And so you have this total disparity and inequity, right? And literally placing, as they say, man's inhumanity to man, woman, and the earth, we're seeing constantly in our permitting process.
Yeah, so for the research that I've done over the years, I always say that there has to be population specific responses when it comes to the work that we do and when it comes to environmental justice and climate issues, or frankly any other social justice issues. Anytime there's an impact on community, we always need to consider who is being impacted. Like you said, it can't be based off of just like a healthy white man. There's so many social determinants that impact the health of different populations. And so being able to consider what are those things? What does that mean for people to be exposed who are, seniors, people who are disabled, people who, Black and brown communities? There's different social determinants that has an impact on health. And so we can never have one universal standard to which we judge what is health, what is, or illness for that matter. It has to be determined by the specific populations. And so, thank you so much for giving us some context about the work that you're doing and the work that communities are determining that they want to see. One of the things that I'm curious to know is how do you say that environmental injustice and racism are connected to each other?
When we think about the work and the scope of environmental injustice and environmental racism, studies have shown over time that race is a factor, okay, constantly. Now, we want to be clear that our poor white brothers and sisters, as Bishop Barber often says from the Poor People's Campaign, we cannot leave out our poor white brothers and sisters. But where it comes in for us with respect to environmental injustice and environmental racism, a good friend of mine who's uh, the executive director of the Physicians for Social Responsibility, PSR LA, Marta Guaya says, when they create, and we look at deed restrictive covenants and zoning laws, right? Let's go out to California and look at Hollywood Hills. There's not going to be any fracking and drilling and all of that in Hollywood Hills. But let's remember how they created Baldwin Hills. Baldwin Hills was created when Nat King Cole and others, right, were actually making their way, moved to California, but deed restrictive covenants were going to keep them out of living in spaces like Hollywood Hills. Hence Baldwin Hills. They're drilling in Baldwin Hills. So you see where we're going with this? This was a community that was created for affluent blacks. But even there, they're subjected to risk assessments, drilling, egregious activities. This is where we're able to see the intersection of environmental injustice and environmental racism, because at the end of the day, your socioeconomic status does not cover you. We are right there at the fence line with people who are have wealth, major wealth, in seeking to push back harm.
Thank you. And bringing up that point that class isn't necessarily being able to move up ranks doesn't necessarily outdo still the racial realities that we have in this country. And so, given that context, I'm curious to know from you, why is it important for people of faith of all races to follow the leadership of BIPOC environmental justice leaders and communities?
You know, I want to tell you a quick little story about community that I'm from, Wilmington, Delaware. I came from a parish called St. Matthew's Church. And St. Matthew's Church was a majority black church. It was actually a mission church. And I won't go into the history of the mission church and how, certain churches were mission churches and weren't full fledged churches, if you will, in the diocese. But St. Matthew's Church actually was comprised of families who came from environmental justice communities. St. Matthew's Church, later, fast forwarding on, evolved into a relationship with St. Andrew's Church, a majority white church. The two parishes formed a union and became the Episcopal Church of Saints Andrew and Matthew. It's a very quick read. During season of creation, St. Matthew's, the Episcopal Church of Saints Andrew and Matthew, decided at one point to really take on this issue of environmental justice, injustice, because of what had happened in Katrina, right? We saw the people on the rooftops and what have you. But it wasn't just Louisiana, it was just down the road from us on Route 9, where many people were sick and dying and what have you. And so, with that being said, the church decided to begin an environmental justice ministry. And we took that as a sign because we understood and learned, and I wish that Richard Moore was here who could tell the story so beautifully, that at the very onset of the environmental justice movement, and we want to thank the churches for that, it was the Episcopalians, Presbyterians, and Methodists, I believe, who helped the movement be able to fund itself to bring us to the point of today. The church is so important because the environmental justice issues are just another part of the issues of civil rights. It is a civil and human right issue. It is a moral issue that the church must take on. It is part of our stewardship. It is part of who we are and how we are to be. And that's why we are so thankful that we have uh, groups like the Delaware Concerned Residents for Environmental Justice, because those types of groups work along with communities, not just to call them out, but they brought us into what we just experienced this past Friday when the president of the United States centered environmental justice throughout the entire federal family, and the church witness was there. This is where we must be, because when we look at the harm and the degradation and these storms that are continued to rise, it's, yes, it is about the extractive nature. Yes, it is about plastics, but it is about our moral obligation to address racism and the impacts of capitalism and colonization on our land, because for us, with environmental racism and environmental justice, is where we live, work, worship, pray, and go to school. So Guess what, church? You're part of that. We're part of that equation.
Thank you. Um, I guess for me, the next kind of natural question to come to is what can churches do? Um, I'm thinking especially about churches that maybe they're not engaged with the environmental justice now, movement within their regional communities, and so what can churches do to get engaged? With communities that maybe they're not already a part of, or where places that they can get plugged in, whether it be regional or even national work as well.
There are several ways that churches can become engaged. I remember back in the day, and that's something we can go back to if the church hasn't, but the way in which the churches invest and use pension funds to invest in making sure that you can partner up with communities who are in harm's way by some of these corporations who are not doing the right thing and not being a good neighbor. When we look at in that of the shareholder resolutions that you see people make, remember that it was the church that pushed that through with respect to apartheid. These are things that we can take a step. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We have the tools to do what we need to do. In addition to that, we can open up our faith houses. Now, thanks be to God that COVID, we're moving beyond hopefully this COVID situation, but even still dealing with it. But our church houses, we can open our houses up to our neighbors and really listen to our neighbors and find out what's going on. How can we be a good neighbor to you? Right? This is what presiding bishop is asking us to do. We can actually look at the sustainable development goals and incorporate within our RFP, our request for proposals and what have you out of our churches, and have our churches mirror the sustainable development goals. Really look at our purchases, making sure that nasty styrofoam that we don't need in our everything is not cheap and right. It's like we there are certain things that we can do around our church facilities, if you will, to even uh, support what the communities need. Many things. And then there's just to give a plug to a table around that we are engaged in around climate and environment. It's called ajustclimate.org, where we keep people updated on the climate crisis, on the issues, how you can plug in, and equally how you can be supportive to look. There we go, the Equitable and Just National Climate Platform. We ask that you sign the platform and follow what we're trying to share. We're trying to be able to provide educational resources for people to have those roundtable discussions and things of that nature. And then again, take season of creation in a fun and serious way. It's such a beautiful the season of creation is a wonderful season I really appreciate because we take that season seriously and bring in different issues that intersect and interconnect with that of the environmental injustice and climate crisis issues that we're dealing with, and have found that people really we take a step back and learn, and then actually recommit our stewardship to the earth and Christ, and for the love of Christ.
Thank you. And I think about how I can't believe we're almost in May, but we're closing up the Earth Month. And so I think the season of creation is a next wonderful season to be able to seize and to be able to talk about environmental justice issues. What are some of the things that you've seen churches do that are creative in being able to get more congregants engaged when looking at justice for God's, people and planet?
Oh, I love how people are right now even taking on land and working with people as we're especially post COVID and these food prices are high. They're crazy high. But in addition to that, how people are creating food gardens. I got to give a shout out to Heber Brown, who I am so impressed with Brother Brown and all the work that he's doing with now even trying to create food hubs, if you will, for our people. Can you imagine just having the access to healthy, affordable, nutritional food and working in a garden together, everyone from the young babies to the elders and and even the ways in which people are creating their own herbal medicinals. And speaking of our native brothers and sisters, really like how it is that we can like really love up on the earth together and one another. That's just a beautiful thing.
Thank you. So going over to one of the questions that we received, and everyone, please highlight any questions that you have or put them in the chat or the Q&A section. But can you talk about how, as a mostly white church, how can a predominantly white church be a better ally to EJ communities?
Excuse me. Oh, you can open up your doors. You can listen. You can learn. You can support. And then you can take action with the folks who have been seeking you for so long. You, the doors who are slammed up tighter than a drum sometime when they need to go to a permit meeting. You who may not answer the bell when they need you to sign a petition and you have 500 people in your congregation. You who may be part of a shareholder process and you can join forces by providing a proxy vote for these folks to come in. But it all takes building a relationship first. It all takes being intentional and open and willing to listen, learn, and love. That's it.
Thank you. Um, so please, everyone, send in any questions that you may have. Can you talk about any resources, any additional resources beyond the website that you showed for a just climate? You shared that, but can you speak of any other resources
Yeah.
that would be useful to people? I know you worked on the Linton resource on water, and even though we're past
Yes.
Flint, that doesn't mean it still can't be used. And so, I would love to know if there's any resources that you can share for people to go back and look at.
Yes, I would suggest that of the Lenten resources because that's a beautiful piece with the World Council of Churches. The sustainable development goals. I really am so I think that that is such a beautiful thing that we as across the globe people are really adhering to SDGs, but we in the US I feel is underrated with us and we really need to be about that and our churches I think can take us there. This can help us when we also think about, we hear people talk about false solutions with our climate crisis conversation, and ways in which to address the climate crisis. But if we're looking at taking on the basics, like our sustainable development goals are speaking to us about, and World Council of Churches, making sure we're grounding our souls, making sure that we are, thank you, there's that sustainable development goal. And I would like to ask all of our churches to take that pledge to really, it would be amazing to go throughout every church and you see that we're all pledged up to sustainable development goals. Then that way we are actually shifting our process of thought, right? We're not thinking about people should be placed in harm's way. We're thinking about precaution and prevention, right? And with that, that can open us up to a whole systems change that we need. Then we're starting to really look at these issues with droughts and other things in a real more holistic way, as opposed to a patronizing missionary approach that keeps people still in harm's way, right? If we can't say amen, we can just say ouch to that, because we've got to stop that, right? And so these are, there we are. And then also take a pledge to our Thursdays in Black. I need to give a shout out for the Thursdays in Black against violence, because really violence is more than that physical violence. When we think about denying people of the right to clean water and clean air and all of that, that's violent in and of itself. So these, when we put these pieces together and think about where we live, work, worship, pray, and go to school, and then the very last is my own personal one for our EJ for all. That's our communities and the Louisville Charter for safer chemicals. You can bundle that up, and we're on our way to creating the systems change that we need to be able to love our dear beloved Mother Earth and her children.
Yes, thank you so much. These are all important resources, and to just plug my organization one more time, we have the 2023 Earth Day Sunday resource, which can be used any time of the year, and that is centered on, we call it Sowing Seeds This Year. The theme being around regenerative agriculture, knowing that the way that our current food system is, it leads to environmental justice issues. The chemicals, the pesticides, the herbicides, those things often leak into community waters, and then communities become exposed to chemical runoff and other issues. And so we're calling for a food system that is regenerative, a food system that mimics nature, that mimics how God created nature to work, and not one that is artificially kept alive by chemicals and other things, but instead, how do we have investments that will better protect, again, God's people, God's planet, farm workers, people in communities, those who unfortunately have the brunt of the consequences of our food system. Um, and so you can find that at creationjustice.org as a resource. And um, do you have any closing words? I'm sorry, we don't have a lot more questions, and so we're gonna close out a little early. But do you have any last thoughts or recommendations for churches, and how do they get engaged in this work?
I just want to say, first of all, thank you for inviting us to this space, because this is so important, profound, and beautiful. And we are hoping that the churches will open their doors, their minds and spirits and hearts. Hoping that even the ministries within the churches will be supportive, from that of the children's ministries to the elders, to be able to, as you say, support these regenerative food system pieces, be able to support the fact that we need clean water, clean air. No one should be without access and the dignity of clean air, clean water, food. I mean, the basics. Like, can we just go back to that?
Mhm.
And can we liberate ourselves through theology to go there, right? And with that, I believe that we, the church, can, as to borrow a line from President Biden, can finish the job because we began with listening to and supporting EJ communities. So let's do that for the love of our mother, our earth, and for God and the Creator. Thank you for inviting us.
Yes, thank you so much, Michelle Roberts, from the National Coordinator at the Environmental Justice Health Alliance for Chemical Policy Reform. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. Please send our regards and our well wishes to Richard Moore as well as he recovers. And so, thank you so much. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. I hope you were able to get some things, multiple things out of this workshop. And please stay connected with both organizations as we continue to fight to do this work around environmental justice issues and really letting the church be a witness and to speak truth to power as we continue to do this work. Have a blessed day, everyone. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.